to in regards to the name of God seems to be quite central in terms of the prophecies of the persons who will come, whether it's Muhammad or not. Can you hear that?
Yes.
The name Yahweh, you seem to suggest and assert that it's in the New Testament, but in a translated term. My question is, why do we find the names of individual persons translated? You quote, for example, before Abraham was I am, prin Abraham geneste ego eimi. The name Abraham is retained because we don't expect the personal names to be translated in other languages. Why do we find the New Testament totally devoid of the name Yahweh, his personal name? We should expect that name to be there in its original form, just like we find Abraham, the name in its original form. Do you have any examples in which personal names in the Old Testament have been translated in the New Testament? That would be a nice example to give to further illustrate and empower your point. Thank you.
Yeah, so
All right, so this is a point that I didn't really think about, so I have to give credit to this brother for bringing this point up. That if you read the Old Testament, Abraham, David, Solomon, Ezekiel, all these people, Job, who else? Aaron, all these Old Testament figures are mentioned in the New Testament and they're translated from Hebrew to Greek. So the question really arises, if all those Old Testament figures are also mentioned in the Greek New Testament manuscripts without any kind of alterations from their Hebrew names to their translated Greek names, why is Yahweh not mentioned at all in the Greek New Testament? Why is it that Yahweh, supposedly being a Hebrew name for God, is not found in the Greek New Testament manuscripts? It would have been very easy for the writers of the New Testament to put this name Yahweh in the Greek New Testament. So that tells us one or two things: that the writers of the New Testament, Paul included, did not think that Yahweh was the only name of God or the name of God to begin with. That's why they didn't write Yahweh in their Greek autographed manuscripts of the New Testament, or that Yahweh was not the only name of God and the writers of the New Testament were using a different name for God. Now, if Jesus and the disciples all spoke if Jesus and the disciples all spoke Aramaic, then it stands to reason that they did not use the name Yahweh for God. If we read the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says Abba. Abba is an Aramaic term for father. So Jesus used Aramaic terms to refer to God. So it stands to reason that when Jesus was on the cross in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Now notice what Eli, Eli means. Eli, Eli is a Hebrew term for God, or it could be an Aramaic term for God. So Jesus, being the Aramaic speaker that he was, did not think of God's name or did not say God's name as Yahweh. He probably meant it as Eli or Ilaha or Allah. Allaha. Those are Aramaic terms. So those terms are closer to the word Allah than Yahweh is to Eli, Eli, or Allaha, or Eloha, whatever Aramaic term for God Jesus and the disciples used. So this is absolute proof that the writers of the New Testament, the Greek writers of the New Testament at least, did not think that God's name was Yahweh. And number two, that Yahweh was not the only name of God. If we read the Old Testament, God's name is Eloha, Elohim, Adonai, etc., etc. Yahweh is not the only name of God in the Old Testament. Just look it up. So this basically tells us that Yahweh was not the name of God, and it never was the name. It was never the only name of God, and that the writers of the New Testament could have very easily translated the Hebrew term Yahweh into, the Greek term Yahweh, but they never did, because when these writers of the New Testament were, copying off the Old Testament, they were using words like Abraham, David, Solomon, Job, Moses, all those Hebrew figures, all those Hebrew names are mentioned in the Greek New Testament. So the authors of the New Testament were writing their names, translated from Hebrew to Greek in their manuscripts. So that means that the writers of the New Testament did not think that God had a personalized name, because in the New Testament, God does not have a personal name. It just says Kurios or Theos for God. That's the Greek term for God. So, like this argument against Islam horribly backfires against any Christian who uses this argument. If a Jew uses this argument, I can kind of get that. I kind of understand that. But a Christian cannot use this Yahweh against Islam argument because it horribly backfires against them. And it shows that the writers of the New Testament did not think Yahweh was the name of God, because they could have very easily translated that Hebrew word into Greek, just like they did with Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Job. All those Hebrew figures are mentioned in the New Testament, but Yahweh is not mentioned in the Greek New Testament. So, that means, like I said, that means one or two things: that the writers of the New Testament did not think Yahweh was the name of God, or that God never had a personalized name to begin with, according to Jesus and the apostles, and the writers of the New Testament got that fact afterwards, and they left that name out in the Greek New Testament. So when they were writing their manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Is this brother right on the money, or is there something else going on here? I think this brother had a really I have to give credit to him. He made me think about, why, you know, he made me think about why is it that, terms in Hebrew are in the Greek New Testament, but when it comes to Yahweh, it's not even attempted to be, it's not even alluded to in the Greek New Testament manuscripts. So I don't know, this. I think this really kills the Yahweh argument, that Jesus and the disciples did not think that Yahweh was the name of God, and Jesus supposedly being the Son of God. Why wouldn't the Son of God know his own Father's name? It doesn't make any sense. So I think this kills the whole Yahweh argument. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.